Hi friends, welcome back. Another little issue here of the Political Viking, also known as the Rick Wagner Show, and getting it right with Rick Wagner. These things are all over on the radio station we have, where you can find it by clicking on to a link on our webpage, politicalviking.com. And you can hear some of the radio show and podcasts, and there's a couple of these videos up. There'll be more. We're still experimenting with them a little bit, so we're not pushing them out too far yet. Soon we will. But we appreciate you tuning in, just the people that are. This week we wanted to talk just a moment about the Peacock Generals that we seem to be coming up with here in the United States. I was listening to a couple of our military historians discuss some things recently, and they were pointing out that we seem to have generals now, especially in the general staff level of like our Joint Chiefs and so forth, that have a whole lot of lettuce on their chests. Now, the veterans out there, and many of you others, realize that those are campaign ribbons. Much of them say where they've been, campaigns they've served in, duties they've done, things like that. Some of the ribbons are substitutes for medals that they have won. And some of the things that are on there are things like the combat infantry badge that you see listed up there. There's a jump badge. There's all kinds of things like that. Rotary aircraft, and then there's patches on the sides that tell what units they've been with. General Milley or Millicent or Miley or whatever his name is, who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, has an 82nd Airborne on one side, which is a great unit. But they're getting pretty fancy. I'm surprised they can get their jackets on. Someone sent me a picture of Dwight David Eisenhower, who many of you remember was the Supreme Allied Commander in World War II, which is a pretty big war, and his uniform, and he had about 2 inches of campaign ribbons on that were maybe 4 inches wide, 2 inches thick, and he was pretty okay with that. I did have 5 stars on his shoulders, but for the most part, there's always a saying that you hear that the fancier the uniform, the worse the soldier. It's kind of true with police officers too. There's always kind of a joke about departments that have like 1,000 different little things on their uniforms. Simple uniforms, simple soldiers usually make the best. Our great warrior generals, for the most part, were pretty straightforward and pretty simple. Ulysses S. Grant didn't have a lot of stuff on his uniform. William Tecumseh Sherman would have looked like somebody's private hang around outside with his shirt untucked until you saw who he was. These guys didn't spend a lot of time parading around. It's because people knew who they were, and they knew their exploits, and their reputation spoke for themselves. The Matthew Ridgways, the Hap Arnolds, the Jimmy Doolittles, Blackjack Pershings, people like that, for the most part, aren't peacocks. And peacocks aren't usually what you want to fight with. I mean, not many people are saying, if I just had a bunch of peacocks out here, boy, man, those guys, they're terrors. Well, I wouldn't get chased around by one, but at the same time, not exactly the honey badger or the wolverine of nature. And it concerns you a little bit when you see that, because anytime there's long periods of peace, and even though we've had people who have been killed in theater, obviously in Afghanistan and Iraq over the last 15 years, it's been relatively peaceful in terms of what you would call a major war. Because the crucible for generals, really for all parts of the military, is a war, a desperate war where a lot of the battles are going to be, in the hazard. They may be lost or they may be won. It's going to take generalship and luck and, the toughness of the soldiers to win the battles. We have all of that, but we have not been engaged in a full-scale war like that for a long time. So as that happens, the political generals begin to rise. Because remember, you get your job as a general, through Congress and the president. And so you get to Washington, you want to get a job in the Pentagon, maybe you're in procurement or something like that. You want to get your general officer elevation as much as you can so that when you get out, not only do you have a great pension, but you can go to work for Raytheon, like Lloyd Austin, our Department of Defense secretary, did before he came back here, and I'm sure he'll go back to that job again, or General Dynamics or Lockheed Martin or some of the defense contractors, because they want your expertise not in being a warrior, they want your expertise in navigating how you get contracts with the federal government. They're huge. So that's something on their mind, and they begin to get further and further away from the mission, and the mission is pretty simple. Fight America's enemies and win. Destroy the enemy. Destroy their will to fight. Protect the homeland, I think, as George W. Bush would have said. They forget all about that, it seems like. And when you see that, it starts concerning most people who are familiar with history, because in the past, we've been notoriously unprepared for wars. We were terribly unprepared for World War I. If it weren't for Teddy Roosevelt being Assistant Secretary of the Navy and sneaking through a bunch of shipbuilding programs, the Navy would have been in worse shape than it was in World War I. World War II, we were not very prepared either. We were just lucky that we had the one thing going for us to help us win that war: enormous productive capability, the commitment of the American public to build things. The amount of planes, tanks, firearms that were rolling off the assembly lines in the United States was remarkable. It sounds like you're making it up when someone gives you the figures. If I had some in front of me that I could be reliable with, I'd give them to you. But if you look them up, they seem like they're made up. And everybody was making them. For instance, I had an opportunity a few years ago to buy a 45 automatic, 1911 GI type automatic, made by Singer. Singer sewing machine made them. They're pretty valuable now. There's not many of them around. Everybody was making stuff, making weapons. We got back up and running. I'm not sure we're able to do that now. And what's disturbing about all of that is that I'm not sure we want to. We seem to think we can negotiate everything, like somehow we have some leverage over people. You don't get leverage and negotiate with people on positions of weakness. And they evaluate folks. Really, the best general we've ever had, who probably was a bit of a peacock himself, was George S. Patton. Remember, he was the richest general we've probably ever had. His very wealthy family. He liked to have his clothes nice. And at certain occasions, like in the beginning of Patton, which is kind of how he could dress when he wanted to, because he had all these foreign decorations and this and that, he'd dress himself up. He liked to look nice and spend a little money on himself. Those pistols he had, two of them, each had ivory handles with his initials on them. He carried a .45 single action, and then he was one of the first recipients of a .357 Magnum double action pistol carried on the other side. So he was a bit ostentatious that way, but when he went into war, not that way. That's because he loved war, in terms of he loved to win, like he says in the movie. I mean, those sound bites from him in the movie are mostly taken from speeches that he's given. That's what we need. It's concerning to see these folks who not only seem to be unaware of what the mission is that they have to accomplish, but are much more interested in spinning it for the benefit of their political masters than they are for the good of the country. And don't let anybody tell you just because you haven't ever, maybe you haven't served in any capacity, or maybe, if you have, you've never commanded a company or a brigade or anything like that. You know what victory looks like, and you know what leaders look like. And if you don't see them, then you know. So we're going to have to keep our eye on this, my friends, and not be complacent, because it leads to a lot of lost lives. Every time we fought a war and haven't been ready for it, had the bad generals. For God's sakes, look how many generals Abraham Lincoln had to go through before he found one that would fight. And then remember McClellan, who wouldn't fight, who had even under massive overmatched situations where he had a lot more troops, still managed to not fight. And remember that in 1864 he ran against Lincoln for president, and the Democrat platform at that time was to essentially make peace with the South. So, you've got to have the right fighters in there. It's interesting to watch. Keep your eye on them. See what they have to say. See the way they act. See if they talk about the nitty-gritty of the wars. Winning, destroying the enemy. Not some sort of soft soap for the politicians. Remember the Vikings, they oftentimes decorated themselves pretty good. They wore arm rings made out of silver and gold and things of that. A lot of it they took off their enemies. Right? They were winners. The losers didn't have any of those arm rings. Keep sailing, my friends. We'll talk to you soon.